is the final video in chapter 4. So we're going to go through the non-cognitive motivational theories, and then we'll finish the chapter with the sociological concepts and some of the finishing concepts from the chapter. So the non-cognitive theories, we use them still in psychology, a little bit in management research, but not very often. A lot of this is more from psychology, but it is something, if any of you take like even a psychology 101 class, you'll probably learn about some of these theories. So the first one is behavioral modification. So this is kind of Skinner's box. I put a picture of Skinner's box here. I'll explain how that works in a minute. Originally, this comes out in a book in 1938, but then it gets the reinforcement schedules and that sort of thing that we're going to learn about in the next slide. That comes out in 1953. So the main tenets here are that reinforcement shapes behavior. Reinforcement is reinforcing behavior that you want people to do. In the workplace, this means the kind of work that people are doing, the quality of work that your employees are doing, that sort of thing. In this, there are things like positive and negative reinforcers. There's punishments and extinction. We're not going to go through punishments and extinction here because we don't use those as much in the workplace. You can imagine, for example, we rarely use punishment when it comes to compensation and benefits. The only time we really use that is if someone does something unethical or illegal in the workplace and they lose their jobs, they lose their compensation and benefits. Most of the time, we think about reinforcers at work. So a positive reinforcer is something that will increase someone's behavior frequency. So this could be something as simple as an employee uh, does a report really well one week. And so the supervisor notes that and says something to the employee like, nice job on this report. You did a really nice job laying out the data and interpreting it and explaining it in the report really well. That's a positive reinforcer. Theoretically, that person will value that feedback from that supervisor and sort of that recognition of a good job, and they'll try to keep doing that in the future. It can also be when we talk about compensation and benefits, this is things like bonuses or increasing people's pay, like merit pay. That is supposed to be reinforcing the kinds of work behavior that you're doing and the quality of work of the work that you're doing as well. A negative reinforcer decreases behavior frequency. So it's giving someone something that helps them decrease the frequency. So that again, this could be as simple as feedback where where you tell someone, I'm really glad that you were very diligent on the last report, but you don't need to spend so much time making sure that this is a perfect report. We just need the data every week. So if you just want to run a report and then quickly just spend 1 hour writing it up instead of spending the entire workday doing that, that would be great. That sounded like Office Space, the movie there. That would be a negative reinforcer where you're asking someone to decrease the behavior frequency of something because you don't need them to do it or you don't want them to do it anymore. Reinforcement schedules affect response patterns, and we'll go through those in the next slide, but there's a lot of research on reinforcement schedules and trying to figure out what will help people be most motivated in terms of either increasing their behavior frequency with a positive reinforcer or decreasing behavior frequency with a negative reinforcer. So the key insight here is behavior is determined by its consequences. One criticism is that it ignores cognition or what's going on in someone's head and their mental processes. So this is purely about what's going on in terms of someone's behavior without them necessarily always thinking consciously about what is happening at work or the situation they're in. It also doesn't always work in all situations. We use a lot of this behavioral modification with children, for example. It doesn't always work as well with adults because, again, that cognition and mental processes, the context and environment really do matter. So let me explain the Skinner box. You don't have to know this for our test, but this is kind of where this theory comes from. What Skinner did is he had rats and he put them in these boxes and they had levers in the boxes. And when the rat pushed the lever, they would get food. In theory, the food is their positive reinforcement because rats really like eating, and theoretically, rats will keep eating forever if you just leave food out for them. So you can train them to press a lever to get their food so that they will do that behavior. They also had negative reinforcement. So maybe they didn't want the rat pressing a lever, like they didn't want it continuously pressing a lever. They might turn on an electric current on this electric grid, which is very uncomfortable for the rat. And so they'll stop pressing the lever because they think that might be the thing that's creating this electric current that's bothering them. And so then they could have the rat decrease the number of times it's pressing the lever or the how frequently it's pressing the lever. So like maybe it doesn't get fat off the food. But this is a negative reinforcement in the sense that the rat stops doing something like pressing the lever to get that electric grid to go away. So it's not bothering it anymore. So that's how the Skinner box works. You can see where the seam's kind of demeaning if we're talking about work as well. So that's where some of that criticism comes in, that it doesn't always work in all situations. One thing that's really helpful in the work situation, though, is this idea of schedules. And a schedule is how often are you going to reward something for doing what you want them to do. And this all comes, a lot of this basically came from the lever with the food with the rat, but a lot of this has been tested in many situations, including a lot of work situations. So continuous reinforcement is when someone does something, every time they do it, they get some kind of reward. For the rat, that was every time they pressed the lever, they got a piece of food. For an employee, this might mean that every time they wrote a good report, their supervisor recognized it and told them what a good job they did. Fixed ratio is after a specific number of times of doing something that you want someone to do, you'll give them a reward. This is very common in compensation if we think about for every quarter, for example, maybe you have these weekly reports. So for every 12 reports that you do, you are going to get a bonus for doing a good job on all 12 of those reports. That would be a fixed ratio. You don't get a reward every time you do a good report, but for every quarter that you've done, 12 reports in a row that were really good, you're going to get some kind of reward. Variable ratio is actually much more common at work. This is after a unpredictable number of responses, you'll get a reward. So for example, you might write a report and some weeks your supervisor tells you you did a great job and some weeks they don't. That would be a variable ratio. This happens a lot at work because most of us don't work with someone else who can give us rewards directly. So they may not know how often or even when we've done a good job or have done something that they want us to do again. And so they just can't reward us because they don't know it's happened yet. So variable ratio happens a lot at work. It also is why some people aren't very motivated, even sometimes by compensation and benefits, because it's an unpredictable number of responses. At some point, they may or may not be able to directly tie whatever behavior they're doing to the rewards they're getting because it's an unpredictable number of responses. Also, if you can think about your work life or even at school, sometimes you just don't know when you've done exactly what someone else wanted you to do or why you're getting rewarded. And so it becomes very confusing. In a fixed interval, after a specific amount of time, you will get a reward. So again, this is where you can have gain sharing or profit sharing, where every quarter or every 6 months or every year, how often that company determines their gains or profit, they are going to give bonuses to their employees. That's after a specific amount of time. Again, this separates a little bit the reward from the actual behavior that you want. So it can be a little bit confusing for employees if you're not very direct and specific about what you're rewarding them for and when they'll get that reward. It can also mean sometimes, though, if you know it's going to be after a specific time, you might do a really good job right before you get the reward. If you know it's toward the end of the quarter, for example, and you can think about this in your own workplace potentially. Everyone does a lot of work at the end of the quarter to get everything done, but then they kind of ease off after that quarter's finished at the beginning of the next quarter, and then they'll ramp their work back up as you get toward the end of that quarter. And then with variable interval, it's after an unpredictable time period. Again, this is very common at work because we can't always see what people are doing, but it also then separates the reward from the behavior we're trying to reward. So variable schedules produce the most persistent behaviors. So things like a variable ratio and variable interval. And the reason, and this is from research, this is not like someone predicted this would happen. In fact, people originally thought a continuous reinforcement or something fixed where people knew how many times or how long they had to do something to get a reward would be most productive or will get the most persistent behavior that you could. The reason variable schedules work is because people don't always know when they're going to get rewarded, and because they don't know, they just kind of always do the behavior you want them to do in the hopes that they'll get a reward. And the fear also is if you don't know how long it's going to be before you get rewarded, you don't know if things that you're doing that people don't want you to do or that are the opposite of the thing you're supposed to do to get the reward will affect your reward. And so that's where a lot of this happens at work, but honestly, sometimes, according to this theory, people will be motivated to do that work anyway. Social learning theory is in 1977, so it's a little bit later, and this is from Bandura. And this is kind of a response to a little bit of this behavioral modification from Skinner in the sense that Um, this is more about the environment you're in and how that environment influences what motivates you. So it bridges the cognitive, so what's going on in our head with the non-cognitive approach, what's going on in the environment around us that we can't control. In this theory, and this is something that I think makes just intuitive sense for a lot of us, especially here in school, our behavior comes from a combination of things, beliefs that we have about the world. So I work in education because I believe education is important. That is something this theory would say I learned because of the environment I grew up in, for example, or the environment I loved school. So that was something I enjoyed. It also, we do a lot of things because of perceptions we have. So we do certain behaviors because we perceive, for example, unfairness in the workplace, or we perceive that our supervisor might like us to do something specific, so we do it. We also can get behavior from reinforcement. So it actually brings in some of Skinner's theory here. But also we learn from modeling. So we learn from others, observing them, but also trying to do the behaviors that they're doing as well. And you see this at work as well when you have new employees and you're trying to show them how to do something else. That's a way of helping them to learn the job. So I use the example when I worked in fast food. I would be at a cash register with someone who knew how to use it, and that is how I learned how to use a cash register was through modeling. The key insight here is that people learn through observation as well as direct experience. And in fact, direct experience is often the most motivating in a workplace. That's why we often have new trainees or new employees working directly with someone else. But one criticism is it neglects internal processes like emotion. So, for example, if you are having a bad day and you have to do training with someone, or you're supposed to be learning how to do a specific kind of behavior from someone else through modeling, if you're having a bad day, you may ignore that and not even learn anything from someone else because your emotions have overwhelmed you or have kind of blocked out the learning processes that you would normally have. So, those kinds of things do affect employees, and it's something that supervisors have to keep in mind. So, all of these theories are helpful at understanding what might motivate people, but none of them are exclusive. You can't just pick one and go with it, and that's the way you're going to motivate employees. But they all have some kind of insight that could help us when we're managers or when we work in HR to think about how we're going to motivate employees and how we set up our compensation and benefits systems to help employees meet the goals that we're going to work with them on. So getting past those theories, the end of the chapter talks more about some sociological concepts. So we have a lot of different kinds of labor markets that also influence our compensation and benefits. Internal labor markets are the employees in your organization, so how they're paid, what skills they're bringing, that sort of thing. We focus more on this when we're thinking about internal promotions, for example, and how that might influence or motivate other employees to see someone getting promoted within. We also have professional labor markets that can drive up the price for people who are professionals because the markets that they're in can differ in how much they pay professionals, how much education or certification they need for their jobs, and that sort of thing. We can also have specialized trade labor markets where people had to have specific skills, certificates, apprenticeships, that sort of thing. Um, um, to do their jobs, and that not everyone can do that job without that kind of training. So that can help those people make more money. We can have semi-skilled labor markets. Our book points out that semi-skilled labor markets are the kind of labor markets where people have some skills, but you can learn a lot of those skills on the job. And that's where unions came in to help protect the compensation and benefits for these workers because these workers aren't moving around with skills that are exclusive to them, like professionals or specialized trade might have. They're bringing skills that can be learned in an organization so that you don't really have to hire a lot of skilled labor in order to do the work that they do. White collar labor markets are probably the ones that are going up the fastest, especially when we think about executives, where some of their pay has become much more transparent, but it's actually jacked up the price of having executives, where the increases in executive pay are going faster than inflation. And then managerial labor markets, so the market for leaders and supervisors within organizations, similar to white collar, but not quite as high. It's not necessarily just executives in a company. That also has its own labor market, especially if you're looking for people with some kind of managerial experience. We also have organizational factors that affect compensation, the size and age of an organization. The older an organization is, the larger it is, generally the more it pays because it just has more resources available to it. Organizations with multiple business units might have different kinds of pay for each business unit because the market for that business unit might be different depending on the business. So an example of this might be these media companies that own like TV stations versus owning newspapers. The markets for the employees on a TV station versus in a newspaper are quite different. The people in the TV station, honestly, this day and age are going to get paid more probably, but that's because their market is different from the people who work in a newspaper. That's sort of a dying industry, but there aren't as many people going into it, and it just doesn't pay as much anymore. Management levels, if you have more management levels, you have to differentiate the pay across all those levels. So that can change the pay for those people in those positions. Centralization of decision making, the more centralized decision making is, the more pay you might have for some positions than others. When you have decentralized decision making or what we call a flat organization, you might have pay that's more similar across different levels in the organization. Information systems help you keep data that can help you determine compensation and benefits. So the more sophisticated your information system is, the more you might be able to differentiate the pay based on productivity or based on the skills or sort of the education that people had to have for the jobs they have. Organizational technology can also change people's compensation and benefits, again, because it's usually about collecting data that helps you determine, or more specifically, determine people's pay. And then communication policies around how you make decisions, what those decisions are, what you value in terms of compensation in your organization. Compensation policy considerations. For some of you who are already working in HR, this might be not new to you. For others of you, this might be a lot of the work that you do if you are in HR. When we talk about compensation specifically, we have to think about what our compensation philosophy is. We'll talk more about that in later chapters, and the purposes of the compensation and benefits plans or system that we have. You might want to think about your communication approach. How do you explain to your employees your kind of philosophy and the way that you've determined compensation and benefits across different levels of the organization or for different kinds of workers? Who has the decision-making authority in that system? What market position? Are you going to try to lead the market? Are you going to try to match the market for positions? Are you trying to lag the market because you're either going to give other kinds of benefits instead of pay for your employees? Or is it a strategy where you hire people below the market pay, but if they do a great job, you keep them and you actually increase their pay significantly at some point in time? Unit differentiation, how different are the units that work within your organization can change how you compensate them. What kind of reward mix are you going to have? How much are you going to reward employees with cash versus benefits versus incentive pay for the number of things they produce, the number of people they've helped, how their team did, whether the company as a whole, made profit, that sort of thing. And then what is the basis for individual pay decisions that you make? Do people need to negotiate their salaries and hourly wages? Is there some other way of determining how people got paid what they're getting paid, the individuals across the organization? How are they getting paid?